Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Welcome back to another episode of Mega Projects. This one is all about the European Union, an institution that might...
The establishment of the European Union. I'm trying to learn more about the EU, and I figured I might as well, stop what I'm doing with the shorter videos, clips of they've been very helpful of how it works and just how did it start?
My country made the brave decision to leave. Not really.
Sorry.
Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Mega Projects. This one is all about the European Union, an institution that my country made the brave decision to leave. Not really. That was probably a mistake. Let's get into it. But before we do, this video is brought to you by News Voice. The news is broken. Almost all US media is owned by just a handful of big corporations.
Yep, media
Fake news,
sucks.
Huge problem as well. And finding something unbiased can be hard.
Oh guys, any of the videos I watch, it's not my material, okay? I just like to watch it along with you guys, learn some stuff, but please, not only, don't skip forward, not only, if you're interested, you use it, but please use the promo codes and links from the video that you and I saw the link on if the product interests you, right, or service. Please, 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 it's really important for them and for me.
News Voice is revolutionizing the news landscape. It is an app that gives you a personalized news feed by aggregating major news sites as well as international independent media, giving some much needed balance. Each news story shows multiple sources which are all tagged with their bias and perspective. The news affects almost everything in our lives, what we hear and...
This might sound really stupid, but was the EU created in the early 90s?
How their bias and perspective.
What?
The news affects almost everything in our lives, what we hear
like
and
92?
read, shapes which people we trust, what we eat, what we buy, how we vote, even how we think. And look, you just clicked on a video all about the European Union, so you're pretty smart. You're gonna like News Voice.
I'm smart.
News Voice is created by its readers as you can upvote stories that you find interesting so more people will see them. It's essentially a democratized platform for news.
Hear that, guys? I'm smart. It's official.
All of the news and all of the sources in one app so that you can be better informed. And it's totally free.
Look at smart.
What? Get started with News Voice today for free through the link below. It's available on both Google Play and the App Store. And let's get into it.
I did not take my medication. One sec. Sorry, I gotta do it. If I don't take it, I get dizzy. Like
out of the ashes of World War II, a new Europe emerged, divided roughly between East and West, capitalism and communism. This new Europe, it lasted just shy of 50 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall set in motion a dizzying series of events. With the Soviet Union collapsing, yet another Europe was about to appear. On the 1st of November 1993, a new united continent began to take shape. The age of the European Union had begun. Much has been said about the European Union since those heady days of the early 1990s. Britain's seemingly never-ending departure, known by a word that I think every single British person is absolutely sick of, Brexit, has shone a light more than ever on the grand union of countries. The European Union has been divisive from the outset, and if anything, age has only exacerbated these problems. It is a complex structure that governs laws, freedom of movement, borders, trade...
Question, guys. If... I'm not... I'm aware the answer very well might be, well, no one is that close, but like, if you were to have to guess, like, if like you knew in the future, like in 5 years, this country left the EU, if like, who would you predict that, like, who do you think is like the most, well, Turkey, no, Turkey's not in the EU. Who would be like the most likely to leave, I guess?
And much more. It is a topic that has a habit of rousing raw emotion in many, but it remains a stand-alone project. Visionary or disastrous? Let's take a look, shall we? Nowhere on Earth has such bloodshed been seen than in Europe. The first half of the 20th century saw wars on a previously unimaginable scale tear Europe apart. Except for a few countries who remained neutral during the World Wars, the impact on almost every nation was horrific. Just in case you're wondering about the neutral European countries, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, and Monaco remained out of World War I, while Andorra, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and the Vatican were neutral during World War II.
San Marino?
It is kind of hard to imagine the Pope whipping out a machine gun. But before all of the 20th, can you imagine that picture of Winston Churchill, with the gun? Just a picture of the Pope with the same thing. But before all of the 20th century carnage, there had been a growing movement of European solidarity. Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, even went so far as to use the phrase the United States of Europe at the International Peace Congress held in Paris in 1849. Obviously, these ideals fell on deaf ears as the continent eventually collapsed into the largest war the world had ever known, with estimates of total deaths thought to be in the region of 17 million. Efforts to form some sort of consolatory system backfired.
17 million or 70? 17 sounds a bit low.
Thought to be in the region of 17 million. All the world had ever known, with estimates of total deaths thought to be in the region of 17 million.
17 million. Wow. So World War II was many times more destructive, huh?
Efforts to form some sort of consolatory system backfired in catastrophic circumstances, as 21 years after the end of the Great War, a new epic struggle began which would totally eclipse it. The second great conflict of the 20th century led to between 70 and 85 million people around the world losing their lives, around 3% of the total global population. In terms of tragedy, nothing comes even close. We've recently done a video on megaprojects all about the Marshall Plan, a US-led reconstruction plan to aid the shell-shocked and obliterated Europe. Now, if you want more on the Marshall Plan, then absolutely do go head on over to that video. We're going to kind of skip over it, a lot of it here, because, we've only got limited time and we do want to deal with the EU. But in short, the Marshall Plan...
Guys, I have this, theory, okay? It's that I tell me if it's wrong, whatever, but I think about it sometimes, and I wish I could write a thesis. Well, I could. Okay, check this out. Okay, I believe. All right, there is no such thing as a selfless action, or every single action is a selfish one in the end. Do you think that's? I think that's true. And I think it's because, for the Marshall Plan, for example, it's like you only do things because it benefits you. Even if you help someone, I'm not saying this is something we should live by. I'm saying if you help someone or you help an animal on the side of the road cross, right? That's still a selfish action. I'm going on a tangent, but guys, come on, just give me go for it if you want. But let's take there's a turtle on the road and you stop and you pick it up, or if you donate to charity or something, it's you're doing that because it would hurt you more not to do it than to do it. And so with the Marshall Plan, it's the U.S. isn't helping Europe in the Marshall Plan out of the goodness of its heart. It's doing it because it's in its own national interest to have a rebuilt and powerful Western Europe, Anyone? So that's my thing. There's no such thing as a selfless action. Uh-huh.
Helped kickstart Europe's rejuvenation. Well, the Western countries at least. Those nations that formed the Eastern Bloc, principally anything east of the Berlin Wall, also received assistance of sorts from the Soviet Union, but it was hardly comparable. Now, it's important to remember that Europe had been pulled apart by extreme nationalism. Countries were eager not to...
I had to use my stupid philosophical question to not listen.
Forms the Eastern Bloc, Well, the EU. But in short, the Marshall Plan helped kickstart Europe's rejuvenation. Well, I mean, the Western countries at least. Those nations that formed the Eastern Bloc, principally anything east of the Berlin Wall, also received assistance of sorts from the Soviet Union, but it was hardly comparable. Now, it's important to remember that Europe had been pulled apart by extreme nationalism. Countries were eager not to make the same mistakes as had been made at the Treaty of Versailles, in which Germany was punished harshly for its role in the First World War, and which most people agree led in part to World War II. Almost as soon as the guns fell silent, there was talk of a united Europe. One of the early supporters was none other than British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who gave a speech at the University of Zurich on the 19th of September 1946, in which the term United States of Europe was used again. At the Hague Congress in 1948, two fundamental structures were put in place which began the road to European unity. These were the European Movement International, a lobbying association campaigning for better coordination in Europe, and the College of Europe, based primarily in Bruges in Belgium, which was designed to educate and provide accommodation for Europe's future leaders. These were small steps, but in 1949, the first major step was taken with the establishment of the Council of Europe. The 10 founding members included Belgium, Denmark, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands.
It's important.
But in 1949, the first major step was taken with the establishment of the Council of Europe.
Okay, so my 1990-something date was stupid.
The 10 founding members included Belgium, Denmark, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden,
Greece,
and the United Kingdom.
Oh, I thought Greece was...
The focus of the Council was on human rights and democracy, and it didn't really include anything on trade or economics. The Council of Europe still exists today and currently has 47 member states and is often seen as a stepping stone to European Union membership. While its aims were undoubtedly admirable, some countries wanted things taken even further when it came to trade issues. In 1952, the European Coal and Steel Community was formed, consisting of Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany to regulate their industrial production, but also placing it under a centralized authority. This was the first real shot of what would go on to become the EU's trade and free market agreements. If you're wondering why coal and steel, well, it was for two key reasons. Firstly, both were enormous industries that would play a key role in future development and hence could make a considerable profit. Secondly, and much more honorably, coal and steel were both seen as vital for waging war. Advocates for the European Coal and Steel Community believed that by tying each nation's coal and steel industry together, it might help to prevent another outbreak of war. Now, this sounds a little sentimental and perhaps unrealistic to pessimistic modern brains, but such was the devastation.
I see this all the time, even in
it might help to prevent
modern stuff. Like, these guys do the same thing. What are they doing? Are they like slowly putting it through smaller and smaller holes as it's extremely hot and pliable, and it just shapes it?
Another outbreak of war. Now, this sounds a little sentimental and perhaps unrealistic to pessimistic modern brains, but such was the devastation in 1945 that you can only admire this attempt to ensure long-term peace. And look, if you're starting to get confused, we've mentioned a lot of organizations already. Well, bad news, we've only just begun. There were numerous organizations, treaties, and collaborations which often worked in parallel to one another. This was not so much a linear system of improvements until the establishment of the EU in 1993, but rather a slightly scattergunned approach as the continent tried numerous different methods, but generally they were all working towards just a more united Europe. In 1957, the Treaty of Rome led to the formation of the European Economic Community, or EEC, which included Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. The EEC led to the establishment of a customs union, which means no customs duties are paid on goods moving around the union, and also spawns the European Atomic Energy Community, Euratom, to develop nuclear energy. So if you're still following along, we have the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Economic Community, and the European Atomic Energy Community all up and running and all pretty much working to build a stronger continent. It wasn't until 1965 that somebody had the bright idea of merging these three organizations into one, now known as the European Communities. Over the next 2 decades, numerous nations joined the European Communities. Greenland's even joined and then left over disagreements about fishing regulations, while the Norwegian government agreed to join but was voted down by a referendum in the country. The last major change before the establishment of the EU came in 1985 with the Schengen Agreement, which would eventually abolish border checks throughout member countries, although it wouldn't be fully implemented for another 10 years. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1991 was a momentous event that was felt the world over. As the USSR began to crumble and individual nations broke free, it began to look like a united Europe might finally be on the cards. German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and French President François Mitterrand were considered two of the key players in the signing of the Maastricht Treaty on the 7th of February 1992, though it came into effect the following year, which formed the EU, originally with just Germany, France.
So I was right. Yes.
In fact, the following year, which formed the EU, originally with just Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. These were heady days, with the first elections held in 1994 and the Schengen Agreement fully implemented in 1995. Excitement was in the air. A new Europe was taking shape. The EU has slowly expanded, and in 1995, Austria, Finland, and Sweden joined. In 2004, the largest single intake saw Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined the Union. In 2007, Bulgaria and Romania joined the EU, with Croatia becoming the 28th member in 2013.
I guess it's not. I was about to say it's after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Never mind. It just seems. Never mind. Forget it.
The political and decision-making system that the EU uses is a complex one, and one that has led to numerous disagreements over the years. EU laws can roughly be divided into two. Firstly, we have the laws that are implemented without the need for each country to ratify them, known as regulations. The second, known as directives, specifically require national implementation measures. These are often seen as goals that the EU countries agree to, but how each country gets there can be different. One example.
Freaking sorry, I just
Country to ratify them, known as regulations. The second, known as directives, specifically require national implementation measures. These are often seen as goals that the EU countries agree to, but how each country gets there can be different. One example of an EU regulation is the common safeguard of goods imported into the EU. This regulation is the same wherever you are in Europe, and individual countries have no say in it. An example of an EU directive was the Consumer Rights Directive, which was designed to strengthen the rights of the consumer across Europe by removing hidden charges and costs. The EU set out a goal, and it was up to each country to work towards it in their own way. It may sound like a single entity, but the European Union is actually made up of 7 decision-making bodies, because we don't have enough bodies already. The European Council, this is focused on the political directions and priorities of the EU. Heads of government meet at summits, typically held every quarter, to discuss all things EU-related and come to some sort of consensus on
Is this in Strasbourg?
the direction they want things to go. This sounds a little simplistic, and I'm certain that it's never this easy. Next up, the European Commission. Once a consensus
So this is like the executive branch.
has been reached by the European Council, the European Commission turns it into a legislative proposal. In fact, this is the only institution within the EU that can propose legislation. Next up, the Council of the European Union. This council brings together ministers from member states within a specific government department, transportation, sport, or education, for example. Approval is needed by this council before any proposal can enter law. Next, the European Parliament.
There's I see the EU as a economic organization. So what business would the EU how does education in individual countries something that the EU has to decide?
Parliament includes 705 elected representatives from the EU members. Like the Council of the EU, it has the power to amend, approve, or reject Commission proposals. Next, the Court of Justice of the European Union. The role of the Court of Justice is to ensure the uniform application of EU law and to resolve any disputes that arise between the members. Next up, the European Central Bank. Unsurprisingly, the European Central Bank is directly responsible for financial stability within the EU. Finally, the European Court of Auditors. This rather dour-sounding department.
Let's see if I can get the flags. EU, Greece, Ireland? Shoot. What is that? Finland? Slovenia, right? Portugal? Is that Romania? Poland? Denmark? Belgium? Is that Spain? That's Denmark. The UK? Well, not anymore.
Investigates improper financial management, both within countries themselves and stemming from the use of EU funds.
Monaco?
Now, before we go on to the European Union budget and where it all goes, there is the small matter of the euro. On the 1st of January 1999, the euro was adopted by 11 countries. Since then, another 8 members have chosen the euro as their national currency. The idea was to maximize efficiency, promote growth, stability, and economic integration in Europe. The other side of that coin, pardon the pun, is that it has sometimes created a rigid monetary policy which has not allowed individual countries who may be experiencing specific problems not seen in other members to control their own inflation and interest rates. This became evident after the 2008 recession, when several countries required an EU bailout after their economies went into a tailspin. The restrictions placed on Greece after their second bailout were seen by many as draconian and led many to wonder whether the EU as a whole would be able to continue in the same way.
So I almost feel like the EU is like a... Is this fair? Like, if you don't have a very competent government when it comes to the economy, like it seems like Greece didn't really have one, that seems like it'd be a really good thing to try and join the EU if you have an incompetent economic government, just to have people in more competent countries when it comes to economics. I hope that's not like I think that's just, and so, yeah, I think that'd be a big reason to join, just for that expertise on economics. You could almost like leave it to them on a lot of cases.
I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that finance is often a bit of a sticky subject within the EU. Every 7 years, a budget is agreed by the member states. This is a decision that has to be met unanimously by the leaders of each nation, so you can imagine that this often takes some time. Each country pays into a pot every year. Some of that goes on administration, but much of it goes on projects throughout the EU, and also some outside of it. But not every country pays the same, and not everybody receives the same. Let's start with contributions. If we look at 2018, Germany, as the largest economy, contributed 20.78% of the budget. France was second with 15.58%, and the UK was third with 11.88%. Each nation pays the
almost
same
50.
2% of its national income, hence richer countries pay more than poorer countries. On the other side, you have countries that are receiving more money than they are putting in. In 2018, Poland's difference was 11.5 billion euros, with
Just like I love the comparisons with the U.S. Like a lot of states take in more federal dollars than they give, and
Hungary on 5 billion euros and Greece on 3.2 billion euros. Now, to some, that will sound like the most absurd deal you can imagine, but the budget doesn't tell the whole story. While poorer countries receive more money from the EU, richer countries and their strong national economies benefit significantly more by being in the single European market. To emphasize this point, while Germany puts in vastly more than it takes out, a study found that single market participation has raised the average German yearly income by €1,000. While Germany puts in vastly more than it takes out, a study found that single market participation has raised the average German yearly income by €1,000. To emphasize this point, while Germany puts in vastly more than it takes out, a study found that single market participation has raised the average German yearly income by €1,000.
single market participation. So that, from what I'm understanding by what he just said, that doesn't necessarily mean that taking in that doesn't necessarily mean that if the countries who gave up, who contribute less than they take in, if they weren't there, that doesn't, like, that statistic, if I'm understanding it right, is kind of misleading, because it insinuates that if a country that doesn't contribute as much as it gives wasn't in it, then Germany yearly income wouldn't be as high. But didn't he just say, like, Europe? Did he just mean that Germany being in the EU has, with the participation, of all the countries, raised it, or just? I can't. If you understood what I just said, then I hope you could answer or something. If not, then never mind. I understand. I don't explain stuff good.
If we take a look at the 2014 EU budget, which came to 135.5 billion euros, almost 40% of it was spent on agriculture and fisheries.
Guys, I know it's so annoying for you. I'm sorry. I just ADD.
Take a look at the 2014 EU budget, which came to 135.5 billion euros, almost 40% of it was spent on agriculture and fisheries. Much of this goes to
Is that bigger than their military budget?
subsidy.
I'm such a frickin' American. What? Spend on guns. Spend on guns.
40% of it was spent on agriculture and fisheries. Much of this goes to subsidies for farmers, sometimes as much as...
Wait, the EU doesn't have a military budget. What am I frickin' thinking?
Agriculture and fisheries. Much of this goes to subsidies for farmers, sometimes as much as half of their total income. That might sound ridiculous, but the truth is that much of modern farming is just not profitable, and the EU, and indeed many countries around the world, choose to support their farmers through additional payments. The development of poorer areas is the second largest sector in 2014, 54 billion euros, 39% of the total was spent on it. 31 billion euros was spent on regional development, which often included roads, railways, education and health programs. 13 billion euros was distributed to the 15 poorest members of the EU.
What do you have, like 20 billion left?
And the remaining 8 billion euros was distributed.
Man, my math.
Among all of the members. Research, education and innovation received the third largest slice of the pie with 12 billion euros. The overall aim is to boost the EU's competitiveness.
Oh my God, no, I was spot on.
Slice of the pie with 12 billion euros. The overall aim is to boost the EU's competitiveness, economic growth and job creation. Now, nobody ever likes talking about administration fees.
Competitiveness, economic growth, job creation.
Economic growth and job creation. The overall aim is to boost the EU's competitiveness, economic growth.
Well, I think competitiveness and economic growth could just go hand in hand.
And job creation. Now, nobody ever likes talking about administration fees. It's pretty boring, but it's only fair to include it here. The 2014 budget set aside 8 billion euros for administration. That may sound like an extraordinarily high number, but with 55,000 employees and 7 EU bodies, you can see how the money gets spent pretty quickly.
Question. It seems like being in the EU is less of an asset the more powerful you are. Like, if you are not a very powerful country, like, isn't Malta in the EU? Like, I mean economically powerful country. I was about to say Denmark, but they're doing fine with their economy. Like, if you're, there's no way Serbia is in the EU, is it? Greece or Romania or a Hungary or something like that, where like I feel like that's a huge asset to be in the EU, because there's no way you'd have the same power on the world stage when it comes to negotiations with other countries on trade and what you have to bring. And so my question is that true? Do you think it's vastly more valuable for a less economically strong country to be in the EU than, say, a France or a UK, or UK's a France or a Germany?
In 2016, the British people voted in a referendum on the nation's involvement with the EU. 52% of voters chose to leave, which began the long, drawn-out and still not complete, as of recording, divorce between Britain and the EU. Ask any British person about this particular time in the country, and they are likely to look at you with a sense of weary shell shock. It was not a pleasant time, as the great debate over whether Britain should take a leading role in a stronger Europe or cut ties and go it alone became rather nasty. The results of the referendum set off alarm bells around Europe, with some assuming other countries might choose to try and do the same. Fortunately, that hasn't happened. If any,
I always see. Look, I don't care if you leave or left or stay the EU. Like, I have zero careness about that. Okay. It's not that I don't care about Europe or Britain. It's just that it's not my place. If you want to get out of the EU and become, more independent in your economic choices, and suffer the economic consequences, that's your choice. And I always see people like, whenever they talk about Brexit, which again, I don't care if you voted for or against it. That's your choice. And if they stayed or left, if they stayed, I'd have the same attitude. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, but it's like people voted. People voted, and obviously there were more people who voted to leave than to stay. But why is it like everyone I hear is like the darkest day in the past, like 30 years of British history, and like everyone was shell shocked. What had, like, I feel like people talk about it as they act as if like something that no people voted for, that just like a catastrophic like meteor impact in Europe, and people are like, every Briton was sad and crying in the streets when the referendum passed. And it's like, well, then how did it pass? Who voted for it? I don't get that. I get, hey, politics in the U.S. is very much whatever, but I mean, you voted, you lost, you won. That's the outcome that goes, and it's just so. I don't get it. I get that it's polarizing, but I don't get how people are like, the darkest day, like, oh God, the bad times. I'm like, okay, who voted then?
The stronger economies, Germany, France, Italy, Holland, and Spain, all seem to have doubled down on their commitment to the project, and an ideal that began after the hellish bloodshed of World War II. The world in general has been caught up in a wave of nationalism in recent years, the kinds which the EU was formed to prevent. The Union is far.
I'm not even apologizing for rewinding.
Happens. If anything, the stronger economies, Germany, France, Italy, Holland, and Spain, all seem to have doubled down on their commitment to the project, and an ideal that began after the hellish bloodshed of World War II. The world in general has been caught up in a wave of nationalism in recent years, the kinds which the EU was formed to prevent. The Union is far from being a perfect organization, but when you look at what it has built in just 75 years, it is quite extraordinary. While Britain is seemingly zigzagging without a clear direction for now, the EU, relatively speaking, remains quite strong. As China continues to grow in power and Europe becomes sandwiched between two superpowers, it makes sense to stick together and build a stronger union. There will always be arguments over fishing rights, budgets, and bureaucracy, but it's important to remember what the European Union stands for. The EU motto is unity in diversity, and there is probably nowhere on the planet with such diversity so close together in a land where the most brutal acts of war ever committed took place. A bond of cooperation and friendship has emerged. Out of the ashes of destruction, a better Europe has risen.
I said this.
Acts of war ever committed took place.
I feel like Europe is the place on the planet where I feel like they're like the adults that have experienced a bunch. They've experienced so much. Like, it feels like they are centuries ahead of other regions in the world who haven't had such constant constant relatively in some small area where just like you fought so many times in between the countries on the small continent that it just feels like you're a bit more wise when it comes to conflict and war because of everything you've been through. So I do consider Europe just kind of wise in that regards of wise in terms of international relations, just because of everything they've been through. It's like, does that make sense? I feel like they are very mature because of their past. You know what I mean? Like, I just see him as like looking all around the world, be like, oh, been there, done that. Oh, that's awful. And so I very much admire Europe and the European Union for that. And yeah, I can't tell you how much of a apathetic, I don't know, words, things. I'm still learning about the EU. Very great video. And I'd love to see all your comments, any answers to my questions. If the high possibility that I said something stupid happened, point it out, please. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.